The Mos Eisley Cantina scene in A New Hope is so weird. It could have gone so wrong. And you know what? It almost did. What were some of the challenges that the production team faced? And why has this scene captured our imaginations for over 2 decades? We're gonna dig through the archives to uncover that story. So you know what? Grab your blaster, saddle up to the bar, because we're going behind the scenes of the Mos Eisley Cantina. I'm Jennifer Landa, and this is the Jedi Beat. Before George Lucas had a script, he had a 14-page treatment titled The Star Wars, dated May 1973. There are some character differences, but the cantina scene in that original treatment is very similar to what we see in the finished film. 2 years and 2 rough drafts later, George was still struggling to get an official contract with 20th Century Fox in 1975. Even though he was fresh off his box office hit American Graffiti,
"Hey man, I'm sorry if I scared you,"
the studio was skeptical about committing to George's ambitious Star Wars script. Plus, his producer Gary Kurtz once said, "Talking robots and giant Wookiees don't read well on the page. They're more of a visual experience." Making matters worse, George didn't have a precise budget for the film. He estimated that the picture would cost about $3 million because in his mind, Star Wars was going to be like a low-budget Roger Corman type of film. But he wasn't 100% sure. So George employed producer Gary Kurtz to put together a realistic budget. They needed something visual and tangible to get the studio excited about Star Wars, as well as to help calculate the costs of the sets and visual effects. They hired production designer Jon Berg to create set design sketches and maquettes, artist Colin J. Cantwell to create concept models, and artist Ralph McQuarrie to create concept illustrations. McQuarrie created about 21 production paintings and 5 key illustrations based on the second draft. The 5th painting was simply titled Cantina. And even though the main character resembles Zeb from Star Wars Rebels, the scene has the essence of the cantina we now know. While the models and paintings were helpful in showing George Lucas's vision for the film, they didn't help producer Gary Kurtz lock down an official budget. For reference, during the 70s, a movie like Love Story cost $2.2 million to make, while The Exorcist had a budget of $12 million. But no one had ever made a film like this before. So after much negotiating, Gary Kurtz told Fox they could make the film for $8 million. Everyone knew it'd be a miracle to pull that one off. As George said, quote, "It's really a $15 million movie being made for half his budget," end quote. He was pretty close because in the end, Star Wars cost $11 million to make. The Star Wars production team was a mix of scrappy youngsters and knowledgeable veterans. This was especially true in the makeup department, which would end up being crucial to the Cantina's success. It was 1975, and makeup artist Stuart Freeborn was working on another 20th Century Fox film, The Omen, starring Gregory Peck. One day while Freeborn was working in the makeup lab, a young guy walked into the room.
This young fella came in, started walking around all my labs, picking things up, and I go, strange. I thought, he's got a bit of a nerve just walking around like this. But then finally he came up to me and he said, "Oh, my name's George Lucas. I've written a script for a film called Star Wars. In it, I've got a cantina sequence similar to what you'd have in England where everybody goes to a pub on a Saturday night." He was so genuine about it. I thought, well, as young as he is, I believe in him. He's got something. I'll do what I can for him. It could be, quite something.
Stuart Freeborn was hired as head of the makeup department for Star Wars. To better understand George's vision for the cantina, Stuart showed George some of his previous makeup effects work. There was one George really liked. It was a blue alien head with smooth skin, a small nose, and a mouth and no ears. The mask had been made for a Bird's Eye green pea commercial, so the character was a property of the food company. But Stuart told George that he'd modify the character to make it look like something new. Stuart set aside the mask for later and got to work on his first project, Chewbacca. It was January in 1976, and pre-production on Star Wars was underway. Stuart Freeborn was working on his biggest, most important creature for the film, Chewbacca the Wookiee. For 4 weeks, he worked alone on the Wookiee, taking inspiration from a sketch by Ralph McQuarrie. Straight yak hair was used for Chewie's long hair, and Freeborn tried to make a monster that looked friendly, even if the Wookiee could be ferocious. Making Chewbacca was time-consuming, and with filming set to begin in March, Stuart assembled a team of 7 makeup artists to help. They had 10 weeks to make the aliens of the Mos Eisley Cantina. You'll notice that there's 2 types of patrons in the cantina, aliens and humans. For the aliens, the makeup team created full over-the-head masks made from latex, foam, fake fur, etc. For the humans, the makeup team made prosthetics like fake noses, twisted lips, false teeth, and cheek enhancements. On set, these prosthetic-wearing human patrons were referred to as the, quote, uglies. Perhaps it was because of their prosthetic features or because some of the actors were repped by the Ugly Agency, which is a talent agency that still exists today in the UK that specializes in unique-looking actors and models. While Stuart spent much of his time in the workroom busily crafting Chewbacca, he guided the makeup artists as they created the Cantina aliens. Nick Maley was one of the makeup artists in that small room in 1976. He was 27 years old, and Star Wars was his first time working on a big creature effects movie. Nick made prosthetic foam pieces and worked with Stuart's son Graham in the foam lab. Graham Freeborn created almost half of the Cantina creatures for the principal photography shoot. He made the Snaggletooths, Tequil and Zutton, Cabe the Bad Alien, Garindin the long, snooted goggles-wearing spy, the lizard-looking Sauron cousin, Saitor Kolfas, and the walrus-looking Mosep Benid. Graham's talent came from both of his parents, Stuart and Kay. The Freeborns worked on all of the films in the original Star Wars trilogy, and together they made some of the most iconic Star Wars characters like Chewbacca, Yoda, and the Ewoks. During the filming of Star Wars in 1976, Kay spent the majority of the time working with the actors on set. She combed Chewbacca's hair, helped actor Paul Blake put on his Greedo head, applied makeup to Peter Cushing as Grand Moff Tarkin, and created Princess Leia's glamorous makeup look. Here's Carrie Fisher's Leia makeup chart for The Empire Strikes Back, and you can see all of Kay's notes on the chart that really give a glimpse of what a skilled makeup artist she was. The Freeborns obviously had a large presence in the makeup workshop, but there were others modeling and molding in that small workroom in Elstree Studios. Charles Parker created the prosthetics that he later applied to the human Cantina characters like Dr. Cornelius Evison and Wooher the bartender. Sylvia Croft, who was a makeup artist friend of Kay Freeborn's, helped make teeth and assemble items when she wasn't needed on set. Makeup artist Chris Tucker created Ponda Baba, then known as Walrus Man, the ill-fated character that gets his arm cut off by Obi-Wan Kenobi. Chris also created the Yam-Re alien, which is the praying mantis character sitting at the far end of the bar. Originally designed by Stuart Freeborn, Chris made the elaborate puppet that unfortunately can barely be seen in the film. Effects and makeup artist Robin Grantham worked with Stuart Freeborn to create Snailhead, who we now know as Tisvit. This character has a human body, but its head resembles a fly. Again, the fly alien looks great, but he too can barely be seen in the background. Since the makeup effects team only had 10 weeks to create a bar full of aliens, they ended up repurposing some of Stuart Freeborn's old masks from previous jobs. One mask was a blue alien with smooth skin, a small nose and mouth, and no ears. Graham Freeborn started the transformation of Greedo. Kay Freeborn and Sylvia Croft made Greedo's hands using latex dishwashing gloves. Greedo's spiky mohawk was created out of foam latex, and Nick Maley painstakingly applied each wart on the Rodian's head. Large pupilless eyes were added over the alien's existing eyes, and Tulane-based paint was used to transform the creature from blue to green. Of course, not all the characters were slam dunks. One day, George Lucas walked into the workshop. He had an idea for a Cantina character. As Nick Maley said, quote, George came in with a drawing of a multi-eyed blob that he'd done while sitting in the airport. And yeah, we built it, and we all hated it, end quote. That blob is now known as Weoslia, the insectoid land speed dealer that buys Luke's X-34 for 2,000 credits. She is odd-looking, but I'm sure that she has fans out there who love her. While Stuart and his team had a lot of creative freedom in creating the Cantina characters, George and his costume designer John Mollo were frequent collaborators. According to Mollo, he and George sat down and created a complete chart of every bar patron. First, he'd draw a figure for each type of person, and George would tell him how many space pilots, Martians, peasants, and pirates he wanted. Then John would pair those costumes with the heads Stuart had designed and could produce. The makeup effects team worked as quickly as they could during those 10 weeks. They had finished most of the background characters and were beginning on the creatures that would get their close-ups on film. George moved the Cantina sequence up a week earlier in the shooting schedule, so time was running out. Not to mention, he kept adding monsters to the roster. But they were 3/4 of the way done, and they could finish all the creatures George was asking for if they just stayed on target. It all came to a grinding halt when Stuart Freeborn became sick and needed to be hospitalized. There's no official details about his exact cause of illness, but Stuart himself said he was physically and emotionally exhausted from having worked nonstop for a long time. Being in the hospital gave Stuart the time he needed to recover, and while he was always a professional, his work on Star Wars would have to be left unfinished. It was late March of 1976, and with their supervisor gone, the special effects makeup team soldiered on. They had more monsters to make, and regardless of whether they finished or not, the show would go on. Filming inside the Mos Eisley Cantina began on April 13, 1976, at EMI Studios in England. There were 42 extras on set, and after John Mollo had fussed with all of them, changing outfits and alien heads if something didn't look right, they were ready to start rolling. The actors portraying the humans in the bar had it pretty easy in comparison to the creatures of the cantina. Remember Yamri, the elaborate praying mantis puppet? Actor Jack Purvis, who also portrayed the Chief Jawa in A New Hope, puppeteered the insect. Jack hid under Yamri's skirt and operated it using strings attached to the alien's limbs. This giant puppet ended up being one of the most complex props made for the scene. Actor Laurie Good was a last-minute replacement to play Asarin. According to the actor, wearing the character's head was practically unbearable. In the scene, Good was paired with actress Barbara Franklin, who portrayed the female Soren at the bar, Saitor Kalfas. On set, the two commiserated about how difficult it was to breathe in their masks. Eventually, the pair discovered that the best way to get ventilation was by shoving a hand into the Soren's mouth. One of the big moments in the cantina was supposed to be when Obi-Wan severs the arm of Ponda Baba with a lightsaber. The problem was that during filming, Ponda Baba's severed arm flopped to the floor with a gun still stuck in its weird alien flipper of a hand. The shot looked kinda ridiculous, but they had to wrap the scene and move on. The characters in the UK Cantina shoot are now familiar faces that are beloved by fans, but back on that day, in April 1976, Star Wars looked like a low-budget space fantasy film.
Oh, I have the death sentence on 12 systems.
Be careful.
You'll be dead!
The monsters that Stuart Freeborn and his team created were originally meant to be background characters, not prominently featured in the cantina as they were now. Many of the costumes were from other productions, the mask-wearing actors couldn't breathe, Greedo's hands were wobbly and his fingers kept getting tangled together, which made it difficult for actor Paul Blake to hold his blaster. It's well known that George Lucas's Star Wars had its share of production problems, and most of those problems can be traced back to money, or lack thereof. In September of 1976, Ralph McQuarrie and artist Ron Cobb started making sketches of aliens for the planned reshoot of the cantina scene. George was so disappointed with how the cantina scene turned out, he was determined to fix it. George wanted 15 to 20 new creatures for the reshoots. They'd have to reconstruct the cantina set, and he needed to shoot additional dialogue between Han and Greedo, since he had to act a scene between Han and Jabba the Hutt. Star Wars was already $1 million over budget. So producer Gary Kurtz and George enlisted the help of Alan Ladd Jr., who was the president of Fox at the time. Ladd believed in George's vision and had always been an advocate for Star Wars. Amazingly, he convinced Fox's board of directors to give the team $20,000 for the reshoots. Now it was time to get to work on the cantina again. Since the cantina reshoot would take place in Los Angeles, they needed a talented makeup effects supervisor who was also a local hire. Thanks to a referral by visual effects artist Dennis Murin, 25-year-old Rick Baker got the job. Rick had 6 weeks to make as many crazy-looking monsters as possible, but he couldn't do it alone. Even though he had committed to working on Star Wars, he was simultaneously working on the sci-fi horror film The Incredible Melting Man. Rick had to give The Incredible Melting Man priority since they hired him first, and they were paying him more than Star Wars. So to help get the job done, Rick put together a makeshift creature shop and hired 5 artists and stop-motion animators. Rick would supervise the team since his time would be divided between the 2 film sets. The new Cantina creature crew was young, excited to have the opportunity, and hungry to show off what they could do. There was model maker Lane Liska, who worked on the aliens Hem-Dazan, Muff Tack, and the Godels, stop-motion animators Jon Berg and Phil Tippett, who both designed the holochess sequence on the Millennium Falcon, makeup effects artist Doug Beswick, who sculpted the Bith Band, and assistant makeup artist Rob Botten, who was a protege of Rick Baker's. Over the course of those 6 weeks, the second unit crew made some of the cantina's most memorable patrons, like Moma Nadon, then called Hammerhead, Muff Tack, in Figrin Dan and the Modal Nodes. Some were based on the designs by Ralph McQuarrie and Ron Cobb, some were complete originals, and because they had no money, some were creatures created over existing masks that Rick had made for other jobs, like the blue milk-sipping werewolf that is featured in the original cut of the film. That mask was originally made by Rick Baker for a mini mass production of Halloween werewolf masks in 1973. 2 Cantina characters were made from that mask, but Rick Baker was relieved when they were both replaced in the special edition of A New Hope. He once shared on Twitter that he was happy with the change because he thought they would be in the background and not used in the close-up shots. Another mask that was recycled from Rick Baker's inventory is a character named Terminal Man. He's the gaunt-faced older gentleman sitting behind Moma Nadon. The slip-on mask was Baker's original take on Frankenstein's monster. Here's Rick Baker in 1977 wearing that mask during a CBC interview.
Why do you have these little metal things up there?
I just thought they would look nice.
So are you sort of half man, half machine? Or?
Yeah, something. We have complete freedom. Aliens, you have no idea what they are. Do I have to talk with this thing on?
No, you can take it off. Oh, that's wonderful. That's really marvelous.
Like the werewolf, Terminal Man was also made as a Halloween mask. Model maker Lane Liska was in charge of transforming the mask into the character we now know as Trinto Duaba. One day, while Rick and his team were in the workroom, George came in and said he wanted to do a scene with a band of aliens playing some music. Rick told George he didn't think he'd be able to make a bunch of new alien musicians with what time was left. Then Rick noticed a mask in the corner. He proposed doing a mask cast of that mask so that all the alien band members were identical. George liked the idea, and Doug Beswick was put in charge of sculpting the masks. The Biff Band was formed. At the end of the 6 weeks, Rick Baker and the second unit crew had made almost 30 aliens for the Cantina, and on January 24th and 25th, 1977, the team assembled in a small studio on La Brea Avenue in Los Angeles. The set was basically a bandstand and a booth where the new aliens would drink and mingle. The first shot of the day was the Han and Greedo encounter. George needed to add some dialogue to the scene that could explain why Han owed money to Jabba, since the scene with the hut had to be cut. Only Greedo would be on camera since Harrison Ford's lines would be dubbed in later. But George also wasn't happy that Greedo's mouth didn't move like the character was actually talking. So Doug Beswick added a small mechanism to the mask that would help move the mouth and appear more realistic. Actor Paul Blake portrayed Greedo in the UK shoot, but in Los Angeles, the Rhodian was played by actress Maria de Aragon. For the reshoot, they gave Maria a new, sturdier pair of alien hands to wear. You may have seen the behind-the-scenes photos of Greedo wearing pink heels. Perhaps Maria wore them so that she could match Paul Blake's height, but rumor has it that she wore the high heels simply because she liked them. While Maria was waiting for the crew to set up Greedo's first shot of the day, the mouth mechanism in the mask broke. They couldn't fix it. Instead, George instructed Maria to hold a clothespin between her teeth. This went to the end of Greedo's long mouth, so whenever the alien needed to talk, Maria would move the clothespin around with her teeth. The mood on the reshoot set was pretty lively and fun. It was an informal shoot with a small crew that included George Lucas, Gary Kurtz, and George's friend, Carol Ballard, to operate the camera. Most of Rick Baker's team ended up portraying their alien characters on set. Jon Berg puppeteered Hammerhead, the Thorian we now call Moma Nadon. He actually finished making the creature on the day of filming. It was just the head, torso, and arms, but the character looked fantastic. During filming, Berg worked the puppet while Phil Tippett sat in the shadows of the bar and controlled the mechanism that opened and closed Hammerhead's eyes. The fun continued the next day when Figrin Dan and the Modal Nodes were set to perform. The shoot began at dawn. Lane Liska, Jon Berg, Phil Tippett, Rob Bottin, and a few other ILM employees were dressed in costume. Unfortunately, Rick Baker was working on The Incredible Melting Man that day, so he couldn't partake in the fun. George had envisioned the Modal Nodes as an intergalactic swing band, so to get the rhythm of their movements just right during filming, George put on Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing. The Bith crew danced to the beat, moving their instruments about as if they were playing a jizz tune. Everyone was having a blast, but by midday, the masks had become really hot. Because the job was so rushed and the team was so inexperienced, they forgot to put air vents in the mask. Here's Rick Baker reflecting on that oversight.
One of the things that I didn't even think to mention to these guys, because it was so ingrained in my thing from making masks and all that, you have to be able to breathe when you have these things on. One of the things that they found out is the band members is they didn't make provisions in the masks for good breathing or for scene. They had these band member masks on, which at first they weren't getting enough air, and all of a sudden you'd see the head start caving in as if we're breathing, And so they kind of learned, the stop motion guys learned a little bit about makeup stuff in that day.
There was one final insert shot that would make the cantina scene complete, and that was a juicy close-up of Ponda Baba's severed arm and head. ILM visual effects artist Lorne Peterson was put in charge of creating an epic ending to the laser sword confrontation. For the floor of the bar, Lorne used white plastic grating normally used in light fixtures. To bloody up the severed parts, he used raspberry yogurt mixed with red tempera paint. And to make it even more gruesome, he rigged wiring underneath the floor to make the body parts twitch. When Gary Kurtz watched the sight gag on camera, he thought it was too much. If they wanted a PG rating, they'd have to 86 the twitching and lose the severed head in the shot. Another infamous change was Ponda Baba's hands. Of course, that one was by accident. So why did the Aqualish have a werewolf hand instead of the fin-like hand that we see in the wider shot? According to VFX artist Lorne Peterson, Gary Kurtz dropped off a box at the studio with the character's sleeve and hand for the reshoot. Only problem was, it was the wrong hand. Apparently, it belonged to the Wolfman character that was owned by Rick Baker. Lorne hadn't seen any of the cantina footage that was shot in England, just some production stills of Ponda Baba and Dr. Evazan. And those shots were from the waist up. Things were moving so fast at this point in the Star Wars production that no one caught the continuity error. And while it was a mistake, it turned out to be an unintentional Easter egg for us fans. Mix-ups aside, the reshoot was a success, and the production team had fun doing it. The cantina reshoots would fit seamlessly with the principal photography shots, and as we know, once Star Wars was released in theaters, it would go on to change cinema and pop culture from that day forward. But how did the maker feel about the cantina scene once it was all said and done? Ever the perfectionist, George made a number of changes in 1997 to the original trilogy known as the Special Editions.
When we were thinking about reissuing the films for the 20th anniversary of Star Wars, of fixing them up, and I said, well, this is a great chance for me to experiment with a new technology and see if I can do the prequels, and at the same time fix a lot of things that I was really frustrated with the first time around with Star Wars that I couldn't complete properly because I either didn't have enough time, money, or technology to do it with. And so that was a great experience for me.
In A New Hope, George cut out the close-ups of Rick Baker's Wolfman and sprinkled in a few new cantina characters throughout the scene. The CGI bar patrons look great, but some critics believe the scene should have remained the same for the sake of cinema history.
I'm not a big fan of changing films after they're released. I think you have to let it go. Jean Renoir said at one time, the sign of a good artist is knowing when you're done. You don't want to damage the work by continuing to work on it beyond the point in which it's good. And knowing when that is difficult sometimes.
Some maybe George Lucas and Jean Renoir don't agree. And whether you like the changes or not, I think we can all agree with stop-motion animator Jon Berg on why the Mos Eisley Cantina works so well.
What George was going for, I believe, was kind of his science fiction equivalent of the saloon in old westerns, and yet and the whole beginning with Lane Liska's character, that little T-bone shaped character that pops up, the music, everything. There's a radical change of pace because you have this wonderful foreshadowing when Alec Guinness is saying, "Oh, geez, you don't want to." Oh man! Next thing you're in there, and bang! The music is really terrific, and you're just looking at one bizarre thing after another. Where am I? What is this? I think that's part of the charm of it.
The Mos Eisley Cantina scene in A New Hope showed audiences a fantastical world that was magical yet believable. Chalmun's Cantina looked like an intergalactic dive bar that was full of regulars who had some legendary tales to tell. Unfortunately, many of the masks used in the cantina scene became eroded over time. Thankfully, the brilliant Rick Baker has done recastings of some of the original molds he used for Star Wars, like the werewolf, the devilish Deveronian, and the veined head Pons Limbic. Rick gifted several of the cantina masks and costumes to his friend and mentor Bob Burns. If you don't know, Bob and his late wife Kathy, who passed away in 2021, became known for owning the largest private collection of film props and memorabilia. Since a lot of the masks were misshapen or distorted over time, Bob and Kathy sent some of the originals to Tom Spina Designs, who specializes in restoring film props, costumes, and masks. Practical makeup effects have unfortunately gone out of fashion in recent years thanks to the advancement of AI and CGI, but I'm glad that anytime we want to watch Snaggletooth and Hammerhead enjoying a drink at the bar, the Cantina will always be there. What are some of your favorite moments from this scene? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe because on the next episode of Jedi Beat, we're going to be going to the weirder side of Star Wars. Yes, even weirder than the Star Wars Holiday Special. Thanks for joining me, and until next time, this has been the Jedi Beat.